how does that data relate to the problem that many economists are deeply concerned with, which is household income inequality? The answer that we offer to that is based upon a statistical relationship between our measures and, for purposes of convenience, the original Deininger and Squire World Bank data series, about 400 and some observations, exactly overlapping with respect to country and time, from which we're able to calculate that relationship and then to go and estimate a data set for household income inequality from our measures of inequality of industrial pay. I won't dwell on the regression analysis except to say that the variable that's of interest here is the relationship of our measure of inequality to the World Bank's measures, and it's a very stable relationship, very stable positive relationship. Ours is more volatile than Gini coefficients, which are damped, but they move in parallel. The other variable that's important is the degree of industrialization, which we measure as manufacturing employment to population. The more you have of that, the more equal you're likely to be. The rest of it is simply dummy variables to adjust for the different types of data that are available on the basis of surveys, in particular, whether the data are based on income or on consumption, whether they're based on households or persons, whether they're gross or net of tax. Overlapping observations about 430. From this, we're able to compute an estimated data set of household income inequality with almost 4,000 observations. It will have 4,000 of the next update over the years now from 1963 to 2008, and we're working up to 2012 or so. But the question, once you do that, are your measures any good? Do they correspond with what other people are measuring, what other people have measured? And here, I'm afraid I'm going to inflict upon you a long series of rather messy charts. It will give you a sense for just how messy this literature is. One of my students, actually two of them, Beatrice Halbach and Alexandra Malinowska, went into this literature with a kind of passionate intensity and simply copied every inequality number they could find for a whole series of countries, classified them very carefully according to the type of measure, and then plotted them on line graphs so that we could see whether our estimates fit within the range that the established literature had found. So let's just take the wealthy countries first. Here's one. Here's Canada. And you can see there are basically three types of measures in the survey literature. The green are market income, which I don't like very much, but it's very high. It's the income that excludes income from government sources, so pensions and so forth are not in that measure. The red is disposable income. That's after transfers and taxes. And the blue is gross income, which is after transfers but before taxes. Our estimate is the black measure, and it sits right where it should be, in the middle of the various estimates of gross income inequality. It also has essentially the same trend in the Canadian case as the gross income inequality measure. So if that is the pattern over a whole series of countries, I'm going to offer it as evidence that our very simple model, which just is based on two coefficients, one of them being inequality of industrial pay, which is the active coefficient, does a very good job of capturing both the level and the movement of gross income inequality. And now we go through and show you the mess. This is Denmark. You can see Denmark's a very highly studied country, but there are lots of different measures, and they're not exactly the same. So one has market, gross, and net, and ours falls nicely in the middle of the gross. Similarly, France is a country with very sloppy measures, but we're again in the middle. Germany is a country with excellent measures. I like them because ours lies exactly along the line of the gross income inequality survey. This is the late and unlimited Deutsche Demokratische Republik. You can see it. Inequality declined to the point where the country collapsed. Greece, sloppy measures, but our model seems to work pretty well. Italy, similarly, Japan, Netherlands, Spain, Sweden. I don't know why Sweden's measures are as sloppy as they are, but they are. The United Kingdom, we seem to be exactly on track. For the US, slightly complicated picture because our measures fall, while they track up through the early 1990s, they fall below most of the other measures in the late 1990s. The reason for that is that income in the United States, measured income, which is extremely well measured, includes a very large share of capital asset income, which we're not capturing. And most countries' income measures simply don't have that in them, either because people don't have the capital asset income or because it's not effectively recorded by tax authorities, which it is in the United States. These are the CBO's numbers. And you can see a peak for the boom of 2000, a peak for the boom, the mortgage fraud debacle of 2007, the collapse afterwards. Okay. A second group of countries, very interesting, the so-called transition economies, is one which are countries which were moving away from socialism, and they have a very different property. Here's the Czechoslovakia and the Czech Republic, insofar as they don't have welfare states with large tax transfer mechanisms, so the gross and the net are very close together. Our measures, however, still very close to both, and that is true Hungary, it's true for Poland, true for Russia. And you can see the chaos of the Russian transition. You can see similarly the chaos of the Ukrainian transition, essentially the same phenomenon in both countries, massive increases in inequality over a brief period in the late 80s, early 90s. And then there are many developing countries. I only show a few of them. And our measures are, again, pretty good for Argentina, pretty good for China. In India, it's an interesting case because there's only one actual data point available for India that attempts to capture something approaching gross income, and it's that one. It's the Luxembourg Income Studies data, and it's very close to ours. The Indian official data are based on consumption, and they're much, much lower. And India is not unique, but almost unique in relying on consumption-based inequality measures. It's obviously highly misleading to compare them to income measures. I was extremely pleased, but when the Luxembourg Income Study came out with something that tends to support our claim that India has a very unequal income distribution, and I have to tell you that I gave this talk, and a fellow who was responsible for that number came up and told me how pleased he was to see mine, because he needed the support as much as I did. In Mexico, you have very messy numbers, all of which come from a single survey, the INEGI of the Mexican government, and the differences are based entirely on the way different researchers draw on that survey. Ours tend to be, well, okay, close, maybe not too close. We're not. In some countries, we're low. South Africa, for example, we're below the consensus measures. But I would argue that for most of the developing world, we are reasonably within the consensus measures of gross income inequality. And our measures have the advantage of being much longer and continuous in time series and directly comparable from one to the other. So from a research standpoint, it's an extremely useful, I would argue, useful exercise. If you look at the average over all the countries, it's a somewhat illuminating exercise. You can see a turning point here and a turning point here. This is the breakup of the Bretton Woods system, the commodities and debt boom that followed through the 1980s, and then from 1980 to 2000, you see basically rising inequality, which peaks after 2000. The reason this comes down in this period is that you're adding in low inequality countries from the formerly socialist world, so that brings down the average. I could do a more sophisticated measure, but this is just to give you the idea that there are definitely global trends here. And when you look at the turning points, it appears that those trends are associated with the major movements of global finance. That is to say, with the way the world economy is governed. With the breakup of the Bretton Woods system, there was a period of strong instability which ended in a vast crisis, which went on for 20 years and went around the world from Latin America and Africa to Central and Eastern Europe, and then finally to Asia in 1997. In 2000, again, a turning point. Interest rates fell, commodity prices rose, and the conditions of the world economy made it possible for governments that were so inclined, Brazil, for example, to pursue policies once again that reduce poverty and inequality in their domestic spheres. All right. I want to give you an overview of the household income inequality numbers. These are now on a scale that is simply the familiar Gini coefficient. Dark blue is the lowest numbers, red is the highest, yellow, orange, red, a natural gradient. And you can see in the 1960s a world in which the advanced countries had relatively large middle classes and relatively low inequality measures. And the countries of the tropical and developing world had the opposite, relatively small, if not non-existent, middle classes and relatively high inequality measures. These are just decade by decade averages. So to give you a picture of the coverage of the data over time and what's happening to it, again, something which is visible, and you can see as we go into the 1980s and particularly into the 1990s, there we are, as the Eastern world comes into the data set in a clear-cut way, that things are really changing. And in the 2000s, the world of the 2000s looks much more like the developing world of the 1960s, with only just a few countries here, Sweden, Finland, maybe one of the Baltics is in there, that Czech Republic, that continue to have measured levels of household income inequality that were comparable to what most of the advanced world had in the 1960s. So the world really has become more unequal over and particularly as a result of this vast period of rising inequality in the neoliberal era of the 1980s and 1990s. That's the broadest picture I can draw for you. But I want to say now a word or two about causal mechanisms. Because showing the trends and showing the turning points, I think, carries some weight, but it is helpful to develop the argument with a greater degree of intensity and detail. And yet another one of my students, a very talented Argentine named Maria Delfino Rossi, after a brief term as a director of the Argentine Central Bank under Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner at the age of 26, came back to finish her master's degree and decided she would do something useful. And what she decided to do was to tabulate exchange rate movements and see if they matched up to our inequality measures. And I suggested a hypothesis for her that would explain why this might be the case. The hypothesis is very simple. If you look at the industrial pay scales, if you look at the structure of industry, any country has two industries, those that export and those that don't. And it is a general rule that countries export their best products and their highest paid workers are in the export sector. So when there is a decline in the exchange rate, a depreciation, the exporters instantly have more income because the foreign income, the dollars or the euro that they're earning, go up in local currency terms, whereas those who do not export are still being paid in the local currency, in the peso or in the renminbi. And that being the case, the inequality will rise. So one ought to expect that the exchange rate and the inequality measures are correlated. The question is that correlation something that is systematic and is it strong? So that's what Delfina did, and here's what she found. I'll just go through a series of countries in alphabetical order. A upward sloping line is a, let's say, support of our hypothesis. So there's Bangladesh, there's Brazil, there's Cameroon, there's Canada, there's China, there's Czech Republic, there's Hungary, there's India, there's Ireland, there's Mexico, there's Peru. Particularly the smaller Romania, developing countries, this relationship is just exceptionally strong. There's Singapore. There's the Netherlands. Okay, it's not so strong for the Netherlands, but that's a dollar exchange rate. And there's Tunisia, and that's before the euro, of course, Turkey, Uruguay. Okay, one exception, Italy. I won't need to remind you what Richard Nixon said he thought about the lira. But in any event, the fact is, it's an overwhelmingly strong relationship. And not only is it strong, it captures a very large share of the variance in industrial pay. And I've already shown you that the variance in industrial pay is a very good predictor of the variance and even the level of household income inequality. So I want to suggest to you, since there's no possibility that the exchange rates are driven by inequality, that the causal arrow here clearly must run from the movement of the international financial markets, currency markets, to the structures of pay, particularly in vulnerable developing countries, and from there to the structures of household income. It's obviously not the only thing that's going on, but it is a powerful enough force to suggest that it cannot be neglected in any serious discussion of what should be done to alleviate the rise of inequality around the world. And it also suggests very clearly that if you look at the picture in the last year or so, in which the currencies of the rich countries have been rising, and that of the United States particularly, and the currencies of the developing world have been falling, that when we are in a position some years from now to update this data, we're going to find that the inequality has risen again dramatically. But I think it's obvious that it has. If you look at Latin America, confluence of economic and political events are driving inequality up and reversing the gains of the last 15 years. That's what's going on in the world. And what's going on in the world is a demonstration of the power of finance. And unless that power is controlled and regulated, it will come back again and again to undo the work of progressive social movements, progressive governments, trade unions, social development forces, by making it harder and harder for poor people to keep up with the wealthy. It's a very straightforward argument, I think, and one which the data have lent a considerable, one to which the data have lent a considerable amount of support. Okay, I got one other thing. This is a digression. This is a digression because I've come here from the land of Trump, and I'm sure you want to know what's going on in the United States. This is a comment about the effect of inequality on American election outcomes. And we did a calculation to take account of the fact that in the United States, presidential elections are decided state by state in the Electoral College. And so one has to ask the question, does the inequality or change of inequality in a state have an impact, or is it related to how each state voted in the last election? The last election was characterized by a campaign of extraordinary anger that's often referred to as populist, and often associated with rising inequality. So I think if I asked you whether you expect a state which had a very sharp rise in inequality to be more inclined to vote for the Democrat or for the Republican, I would guess, based upon the few times I've asked this question of other audiences, that most of you would say that the rising inequality would make people angry to vote for the Republican. And that's a very common sense response. I hope that's the one you had in mind. But as you will see, it's exactly wrong. This is a map of how the counties of the United States voted: red, Republican, blue, Democratic. And what we did was to calculate the change of inequality from employment and earnings data in the United States on an annual basis by state, data which were not previously available because some of the states were too small for survey-based measures, and then associate that change from 1990 to 2014, with the election outcome. The blue diamonds are the Clinton states, the red circles are the Trump states. And the interesting fact is that the 14 states with the largest increases in inequality, every single one of those states was a Clinton state. Every single one. You look at the labels here, There's New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, California, Maryland, Rhode Island, Nevada, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Illinois, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Oregon. The Trump states down here with the lowest increases in inequality: West Virginia, Wyoming, Oklahoma, Utah, Nevada, Idaho, Kentucky. And then there's a group in the middle which are contestable. And it's interesting that the states that Trump won, decided the election, Pennsylvania, and let's say Minnesota didn't win, but it was Ohio here, were states where the rise of inequality was relatively less. And a state like Texas, which he won, was a state where inequality has actually been increasing, and it moved toward the Democrats in this election. What do we make of it? I would suggest that there is a relationship, but the relationship really reflects the structure of American politics. The Democratic Party is a coalition of the rich, liberal, urban professional and the immigrant and the minority, the African American community, relatively poor. When those two communities are dominant in a state, that's a Democratic state. When those two communities are weak, in states which are largely rural or where the urban and industrial population has been falling because of deindustrialization, that's Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, those states are drifting to the Republicans. So I think we have an index which is not only good for analyzing financial power, but also has a certain amount of interest in analyzing the way in which political developments unfold. And I think it's true not only in the US, but you can analyze the Brexit vote and the French elections and other elections through the same general metrics. So I just hope that encourages you to think that there is some prospect for data-driven work in economics and some prospect for help for using that information to help us understand the dilemmas of the world around us. Thank you very much. I promised 45 minutes. I see I spoke for 46 minutes and 13 seconds. And I hope I've left time for questions if you have some.